Sanderson. This particular Lexington militiaman served as a mounted scout in the early morning and watched the Battle of Lexington from the back of the common. After the battle, he went home to retrieve his musket and his accoutrements, knapsack, cartridge box, bayonet. Unfortunately, his teenage brother got there first and took him from him. So as a result, Sanderson was forced to watch the afternoon of fighting in Lexington from a nearby hilltop. James Reed also missed the afternoon fight because he was guarding captured British soldiers hidden inside his house. And at least 4 Lexington men missed the fighting because they were caring for their wives, mothers, and daughters. One account that we do have is Moses Reed and his father-in-law, Jacob Whittemore, carried Sarah Reed and her newborn child out of the family home on a mattress. It is believed that they remained with Sarah throughout the day. This is one of the women I had referenced earlier, who had just delivered a child on just before April 18th, April 19th, 1775. So the family, because she was bedridden, actually carried her out in a mattress and brought her to relatively safety. Another account we do have is teenager Joseph Estabrook, and his father assisted in carrying his mother with a young infant, Solomon, in her arms in an armchair about a mile back from the scene of the danger. This is one of my favorite photographs that I actually utilize for my presentation. These are a couple of reenactors who participated in the reenactment of the civilian evacuation 2 years ago. And the female's name is Hannah. They actually did carry Hannah for the entire length of the reenactment in a chair to reenact the evacuation. One of the questions I got when I first made this presentation a year ago was, this is nice, Alex, you're telling us about the experiences of women, you're talking about the experiences of children, you're telling us about the experience of the male evacuees who were with the other civilian population. Well, what about the black slaves, the enslaved peoples? What is their experience on April 18th and April 19th? If they weren't fighting, if the enslaved men who weren't fighting in the militia companies, what were they doing? And at the time, I didn't have an answer, and it took a little bit of research. And unfortunately, because of the sad legal status of enslaved people in the 18th century, they were seen as property, so accounts about them were far and few to come in between. But I was able finally to uncover at least some information. And at the height of the confusion, at the height of the fighting that was taking place on April 19, 1775, as families had fled to get out of the way of an advancing British army, as the British army is burning house to house and fighting hand-to-hand combat with militiamen, people are not knowing when they are going to see their families again, a rumor started, and it started in a couple of communities. In Monotony, where women and children had gathered in a house safely away from the fighting, a rumor began to circulate that the town slaves were about to launch a revolt of their own, and according to an early 19th century account, finish what the British had begun by murdering the defenseless women and children. Suddenly, at the height of this panic that there was going to be a slave revolt taking place in Middlesex County, enslaved man, Ishmael, appeared at the Cutter family of Monotony. This was a home where many of the women and children were hiding out of the way from the British Army. An enslaved man, he was an enslaved man who belonged to the Cutter family. They were hiding at the house of George Prentice. When he arrived at the house, a terrified woman inside said, "Are you going to kill us, Ishmael?" And of course, the response was, "No, I'm not here to kill you. I'm here to see, if Mrs. Cutter, one of my owners is safe." There's a similar sad account that overtook the women of Framingham. When the town's men and the militia companies mobilized for Concord, a rumor started to spread that the enslaved people of the town had risen up in revolt and were coming to massacre them all. Women and children fled to the home of the Framingham Minute Company's captain, and under the leadership of the captain's wife, they armed themselves with axes and pitchforks and clubs in waiting for a coming slave massacre that never materialized. But what were some of the enslaved people doing on April 19th as all this hell on earth is taking place all around them? They were risking their own lives by remaining relatively close to their master's property to safeguard homes from the British column. In West Cambridge, retreating regulars broke into Cutter's Tavern. The soldiers carried off what they could, left the taps of molasses and spirits casks open, destroyed furniture, and even drove a bayonet through the best mirror and set the house on fire. An enslaved man, Ishmael, the one we had just spoken about, watched the fire from a safe distance, what had happened. And as soon as the soldiers left the property, he crossed the firefight unarmed and saved the family homestead. This is some of the sacrifices that enslaved people who were seen as property during this time were doing to try and save and preserve their master's property on April 19th, 1775. So before we continued, I wanted to at least, as I told you about the brutality of the day, this is an account that I was able to stumble across. A historian named Joel Bowie and Jim Hollister from Minuteman National Park were actually able to bring my attention to this account. If you think about it, this is a militia company that mobilized at some point at 9 o'clock in the morning in Needham, Massachusetts. The news reached us at 9 o'clock in the morning. The East Company in Needham met at my house as part of the military stores were deposited with me. Interesting enough, military stores were deposited at a minister's house. They supplied themselves, and by 10 o'clock, all marched for the place of action, which is much spirit and resolution as they could make, and with zealous friends of the cause could have wished for. But here's the horrifying part, if you think about it. They could easily trace the march of the troops from the smoke which arose over them. That is between the muskets firing and houses being burned. And they could hear the report of the cannon and the platoons fired by the British. Think about what this militia company is experiencing as they're entering the field of battle. They're passing homes with people are hiding in. Some of the roads may be clogged with evacuees getting out of the way, women and children just simply crying and wailing. Enslaved people who are trying to protect homes. And off in the distance, you can see the British burning everything, and they're going house to house, engaged in hand-to-hand combat. This is what a militia company was marching into, and this is what the civilians who were fleeing were so afraid that their fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons were going to be facing. So one of the things that we saw when the evacuation took place was there was a movement very quickly, particularly amongst the women, that they carried off or scrambled to hide their personal valuables. And I got the question, why was there a desire to protect their valuables, whether it be utensils, candles, fabric? Why was there a fear? Sure, of course. The British, they were afraid the British were going to loot and steal everything, but that alone might not be a factor. You're not going to be able to get everything out. And plus, as we're going to see, many of the families are burying and hiding things. Well, it actually goes back to the motivation had to do with Massachusetts colonial inheritance laws. When a couple was married, technically everything belonged to the husband. However, household movables such as textiles, furniture, and the tools of domestic production, silverware and dishes, were generally passed from generation in generation through the female line. And as a result, they were considered properly part of a women's domestic sphere. For example, Hannah Stone bequeathed almost the whole of her estate to my beloved daughter, Tabitha. Hannah Stearns willed to her daughter-in-law, Patty, her porridge pot and flat irons. Abigail Bridge left her riding hood to one daughter-in-law and a dark calico gown to another. So from a woman's perspective, when they are fleeing these homes, thinking they may never, ever return again, a woman's household goods was the closest representation to them of legitimate possessions and gave them a sense of ownership. That's why they're hiding and carrying stuff with them as they're fleeing on April 19th. So some quick examples that we have: a Lexington family hid their silver and mirrors and many other things in a swamp. The Reverend Jonas Clark hid money, watches, and anything down in the potatoes. And actually, I've learned from the Lexington Historical Society, a wonderful organization, that he was also hiding, the family was hiding valuables in the attic as well. Captain Parker's wife, Lydia, took all the valuables and hid them in a hollow trunk of the tree, standing some distance from the house. And Jonathan Loring's daughters scurried to hide the communion silver in a brush heap in the back of the house before fleeing. And of course, the British, as soon as they started entering back into Lexington, although there are accounts also in Concord and Lincoln, the British began to pillage the various homes before they burned them to the ground. Now, when you have your house robbed, or if you have a car broken into, and you're going to file an insurance claim, most of the time you're going to be on the up and up. And you're just going to report was taken, and that was it, or damage. There is a suspicion amongst historians, what I'm about to share you, that perhaps some of these claims may have been inflated, but I will let you be the judge of that. Jonathan Harrington submitted a claim on May 2nd, 1775, that British soldiers had stolen from him an 8-day clock, cloths, books, moose skins, and other articles. Someone had recently asked me, an 8-day clock, whether or not a British soldier in the height of combat would actually carry that off. Levi Harrington deposed that British soldiers seized all his books, carried them into the road, and burned them there. Among them were some of his Latin books, which were valuable to him as he was studying Latin at the time. An account of the real and personal estate of Joseph Loring describes a large quantity of pewter and brassware, 3 cases of drawers, all the wearing apparel of my family consisting of 9 persons. Jeremiah Harrington again said he lost 1 pewter platter, 8 pewter plates, 6 pint porridges, 6 spoons, 1 pair of shoes. Same with these other individuals. They list shoes, caps, spoons, buckles, teapots, porringers, sleeve buttons. They are saying that the British Army is basically going into each of their homes and simply ransacking and stealing everything. And I want you to keep something in mind in the 18th century. Home invasions and housebreaks were considered a capital crime. After murder, this was the most serious offense. If you were caught breaking into someone's home, it was a death penalty. It was, at the time, in the 18th century, because people thought you were violating the sanctity of the home. So when these evacuees eventually came home, if their home was still standing, you can think of the violations that they felt what the British soldiers had done. And of course, we now come to the aftermath of the battle. I will embarrass her since she's in the next room. The picture on the right is of me from a Battle of Lexington reenactment. That at the time, I think she's about 9 years old, is my daughter, who was betraying my daughter for the battle reenactment. Little side note for that. But according to the Reverend Gordon, when everything was over, he described you would have been shocked at all the destruction which had been made by the regulars, as they were miscalled. Had you been present with me and to have beheld it, many houses were plundered of everything valuable that could have been taken away, and what could not be carried away was destroyed. In Lexington, in addition to suffering the highest casualty rate of the American forces for the day, Lexington also had extensive property damages. Several homes were burned or destroyed, while multiple others were looted. Andover Minuteman, Thomas Boynton, as he passed through the town, noted, after we came into Concord Road, we saw houses burning and others plundered, and dead bodies of the enemy lying by the way, others taken prisoner. Another Andover soldier, James Stevens, recalled, we went into Lexington. We went along through Lexington, and we saw 3 to 4 houses was burnt, and some horses and hogs were killed. They plundered in every house that they could get into. They stove in windows and broke in tops of desks. Upon returning home, some Lexington residents discovered their homes had been vandalized and defiled. Mrs. Muzzy discovered that British soldiers had broken her mirrors and valuable crockery, fired bullets into the wall, and left the floor smeared with blood. When Anna Monroe, the woman we've been talking to about several times throughout the evening, when she finally returned to the family tavern, she quickly noted that the retreating soldiers had eaten her freshly baked bread, broken into her supplies, and consumed all of the alcohol in the shop. Her household linens were used as bandages for wounded soldiers, and she also discovered that the soldiers had piled up her furniture, including a mahogany table, and set it on fire in an attempt to burn the tavern down. In the aftermath of the battles of Lexington and Concord, many Lexington residents started to compile a running list of stolen and destroyed property. The approximate damage was a little over, exceeded 4,500 pounds. Based upon my calculations taking into inflation, that translates roughly to almost $1 million in property damage in 2020. Ultimately, as we've seen, the claims for compensation were lost or destroyed and submitted to the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. Unfortunately, many of them would not receive full compensation for the property destroyed. In Monotony, where some of the heaviest and ugliest fighting was taking place, this was a town where, as I've mentioned before, homes were being burned and fighting was hand-to-hand in close quarters. On April 20th, 1775, Hannah Winthrop and her ill husband started their journey back from Andover to their home in Cambridge. As they passed through Monotony, which is now present-day Arlington, she recalled, "What added greatly to the horror of the scene was our passing through the bloody field of Monotony, which was strewn with mangled bodies. We met one affectionate father with a cart, looking for his murdered son and picking up his neighbors who had fallen in battle in order for their burial." Dreadful were the vestiges of war on the road, according to Reverend David McClure. "I saw several dead bodies, principally British, on or near the road. They were all naked, having been stripped principally by their own soldiers." So this is an account where allegedly British soldiers were even looting the dead of their fellow British soldiers. "They lay on their faces. Several were killed who stopped the plunder and were suddenly surprised by our people pressing up on their rear. The houses on the road of the march of the British were all perforated with balls and the windows broken. Horses, cattle, and swine lay dead around. Such were the dreadful trophies of war for about 20 miles. Most of the homes along the path of the engagement in Monotony were littered with dead militiamen and British regulars. According to Jason Russell's wife, where some of the bloodiest fighting took place, the blood was almost ankle deep in one of the rooms, and her house was riddled with bullets. As with Lexington, many of the Monotony homes fell victim to theft and vandalism, and they too reported theft of stolen clocks, alcohol, clothing, jewelry, and furniture. In Cambridge, the fighting in Cambridge was just as bad as Monotony and East Lexington. A Mrs. Butterfield, who lived on the north side of Boston Road, returned to her own house to find her best bed covered with blood and occupied by a British officer. A wounded provincial soldier from Framingham was lying in a nearby second bed. The American lived, but the officer lingered for a fortnight and then passed away. Mrs. Adams was just obliged to step over a dead body of a British soldier in order to enter her back door. In the front room lay another soldier mortally wounded, and the white sanded floor beneath him red with the blood which had flown from his wounds. Cambridge homes were also plundered. There was a home on Pierce's Hill that was occupied by a Mr. Robbins. The family had evacuated, and the flank guard ransacked the premises, destroyed the clock, and set fire on the kitchen floor, which happened to be extinguished by wet clothes that were falling upon it after they had burned off the lines. Very quickly, what about Boston? Boston also had a full panic as well. When they began the word that the British expedition was moving towards Concord, there was an effort by the occupants of Boston to try and get out of the community because they realized what the future held. One individual described very consistent what was happening out in Middlesex County. People were coming and going in confusion. They were all terrified. As this Reverend Elliott described, everything distressing. Well, in the days after battles of Lexington and Concord, the fear then shifted north to Essex County, to our area, which this particular event impacted Newburyport. And it's referred to as the Ipswich Fright. 2 days after the battles of Lexington and Concord, widespread panic once again set in amongst the Massachusetts population. It's known as the Ipswich Fright. Some people know about it, many people do not. This psychological phenomenon actually led to the mass abandonment of homes and the evacuation of a North Shore Merrimack Valley population into New Hampshire. And It all began on April 21st, 1775 in Ipswich. So if we're going to blame anybody, if there's anyone on here on the lecture from Ipswich, we're pointing at you right now. Local tradition suggests that on the morning of April 21st, 1775, a British naval cutter anchored at the mouth of the Ipswich River. Because in the aftermath of Lexington and Concord, the British Navy began to patrol the coastline of North Shore of Massachusetts. And they were actually waiting for orders whether or not to start landing raiding parties as retribution for Lexington and Concord. Well, when this cutter appeared at the mouth of the Ipswich River, a local alarm list, an alarm list is elderly. It's the last line reserve of the militia forces. These are men who were not at the siege of Boston. These are men who may be in their 60s or 70s who were left behind as the last line of defense. The local alarm list mobilized, but there was no engagement between the enemy. Nevertheless, an unfounded rumor began to spread inside the town that British regulars had landed and were laying waste to everything before them. With most Essex County and militia companies away at the siege of Boston, a massive panic set in, and the rumor quickly spread to the other towns. Within 3 hours, the rumor reached Newburyport. And according to period accounts, in Newburyport, a Congregationalist minister named Carey was holding a parish meeting when alarm rider Ebenezer Todd burst in and announced, turn out, for God's sake, or you will all be killed. The regulars are marching on us. They are at Ipswich now, cutting and slashing all before them. Of course, a panic set in, which we'll talk about in just a moment, but the message continued west to Haverhill and Andover. According to an early 19th century account of the incident, it suggested an alarm rider instructed Haverhill residents to turn out, get a musket, turn out. The regulars are landing on Plum Island. You probably heard about the Plum Island Grill, but I digress. As the panic set in, many residents quickly gathered their valuables and fled northward. In Newburyport, Amesbury, Haverhill, Bradford, and Methuen, civilians overwhelmed the local ferries as they tried to cross the Merrimack River to try and flee north into New Hampshire. In Newburyport, and this is my favorite quote, I will let you read this just for a minute before I go on. I am trying desperately to find out who this woman is so we can give her Mother of the Year award. But the account is this Newberry woman, when the panic took place, and we do talk about this particular incident on the Untapped History Tours. But we do talk about this woman who, hearing about what happened, thought she grabbed her child and ran for 4 to 5 miles. And come time to nurse the child, found out she had brought the family cat. I hope when this child was a teenager, she held it, or he or she held it over mom's head. Other accounts, however, in what is now North Andover, Massachusetts, fled to a woodlot which is known as Den Rock and remained there for at least a day. In Newburyport, which I believe now is West Newbury, the houses at Turkey Hill were filled with women and children who spent the night in great trepidation. Sounds very familiar. What you saw in Middlesex County during the battles of Lexington and Concord are now repeating themselves here in Essex County. And of course, in Raleigh, one man yoked up his oxen and taking his family and some of his neighbors' children in his cart, drove off to escape the regulars. Of course, in this panic, you started to see people, neighbors turning against one another, family members turning against one another. One account we have from Gloucester is Essex County civilians were so overcome with fear and despair that they began to turn on one another. According to a period account, a gentleman having placed his family on board a boat to go to Ram Island, which is off of Gloucester, for safety, was so annoyed and so upset with the crying of one of his young children that he exclaimed in a great fright, "Do throw that squalling brat overboard, or we shall all be discovered." Maybe we should introduce this guy to Mother of the Year and together. Another Essex County woman, I believe this account actually comes from Amesbury, fled her home with a market wallet. A market wallet is a very large bag filled with food. After traveling some distance, she set it down to speak with someone. When she returned to the bag, she had been robbed. People had actually stealing her supplies. And this is, again, the mindset, just to get away from the British Army, which they thought was coming. Residents near the Parker River Bridge in Newberry nearly came to blows with one another over the proposal to destroy the structure in order to slow the regulars' advance. Of course, some residents refused to flee. There's one Newberry account of an elderly resident took up a defensive post at his front door. His house was located allegedly on the King's Highway, which would have been roughly near Route 1A or part of Route 1A. He loaded his musket, intended to shoot the devils when they arrived. By the time residents from the interior of Merrimack Valley, including Andover and Bradford, we know fled to Exeter, New Hampshire. We believe residents from Newburyport, Salisbury, and Amesbury worked their way up into what is now presently known as Southampton, Seabrook-Hampton area as well. Some did make it as far as Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But the period accounts suggest that by early evening of April 21st, Amesbury, Salisbury, and Raleigh were completely abandoned by its residents. It was almost apocalyptic in its description, or something you might see from the Walking Dead TV series. It was just absolutely, the towns were emptied out. Meanwhile, in New Hampshire residents are basically saying, what is going on down in Massachusetts? Why are all these people fleeing up here? And eventually, the selectmen and residents on April 22nd, 1775, the next morning, the residents of Exeter began to suspect that, listen, this entire invasion from Ipswich might be just a rumor, fake news. So as a result, they sent a alarm rider towards Newburyport. And they learned afterwards that, in fact, this was a false rumor. There were no British soldiers that were advancing from Ipswich towards Newburyport, laying waste to everything. And of course, Newburyport, somewhat embarrassed, eventually wrote a letter to the Hampton, New Hampshire Committee of Correspondence that same day, where they said, according to Benjamin Greenleaf, we were unhappily thrown into distress yesterday by false accounts received by 2 or 3 persons and spread abroad of a number of soldiers being landed at Ipswich and murdering their inhabitants. We have since heard that it arose in the first place from a discovery of some small vessel near the entrance of their river, one at least known to be a cutter, and it was apprehended that they were come to relieve the captives there in an Ipswich jail. Now, as a side note, for those who are familiar with Newburyport history, Newburyport eventually built a pair of fortifications at the mouth of the Merrimack River. The Ipswich Fright was one of the 2 motivating factors why this fortification was built, because they said there's a good chance that the British Army could land a raiding party, just come right, or they could come right into the mouth of the river, sail up the river, and just rake the town with artillery fire. So this incident, the Ipswich Fright, was actually a motivating factor to create the fortification. So before I take any questions, just a couple of things I just want to mention real quickly. As I said, I am one of the 2 owners of Untapped History. I will let you know that we have some really special stuff planned for the month of April. We're going to be making an announcement tomorrow about that, so be sure to follow us on Facebook. I am also the author and owner of a historical blog that tends to focus on 18th century Massachusetts, and it is predominantly Lexington heavy, but it is also Newburyport heavy in my research. It's called historicalnerdery.com. And I did also want to at least give photo credits to those who took the images of the reenactments. These are people who worked very hard with their images. They had gratefully shared those images with me. So I am grateful for that. So with that, I will, and of course, I also want one final thing. I'm going to leave this up real quickly. Of course, this is me being beaten up at a reenactment we're not going to talk about. But there is my contact information. I am always about sharing my information. So if you reach out to me and shoot me an email, I will share a copy of this presentation with you, as well as answer any research questions free of charge. That's just the way I am. So with that, I'll leave that up for 2 more seconds, but I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Jack to answer any questions the people may have.
Yeah, excellent. Alex, that was awesome. Great overview.
Thank you.
And, being April and knowing that the Lexington and Concord, all the festivities out there are not going to be going on or maybe we'll go on virtually. Just
Yeah.
it's really added to it for all of us.
The neat thing that everyone should be aware of is starting, I think it's going to be on April 18th, Minuteman National Park is going to be sponsoring a virtual Patriots Day. So throughout the Facebook and Twitter and Instagram social media, there's going to be repeated activities going on. What Untapped History is going to do as part of the virtual Patriots Day is we are going to be doing a live stream, real-time postings. If you followed Untapped History, you know we've done it in the past for the Battle of Trenton, and we did it for the Newburyport privateer Yankee Hero who was engaged with the HMS Milford. We're going to be doing something similar to that for Lexington and Concord as well. So be sure to follow us for that page also.
Excellent, excellent. And I did allow the mics to be unmuted. So if you have a question, feel free to go to the left-hand corner and unmute your mic and ask your question of Alex. Mics you can unmute them individually. And because it's such a large crowd, please mute them after you ask your question. Are there any questions? Well, I hear somebody unmuted their mic.
Yeah.
Well, I can say something. Thank you, Alex. It was very informative.
No problem. Thank you. Again, I'm thrilled and honored to be with such a great group, and thank you so much. I've been dying to share this information, and I'm just thrilled that I was able to share it with you guys.
Any other questions?
Hi, Alex. This is Bob Watts. I live here in town.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
And I found this fascinating, and part of it is from my background that about 20 years ago, I lived in the center of Lincoln.
Okay.
And during the reenactment period on, I suppose, the 18th, we would always host the reenactors. And I lived right in the center of town on Bedford Road.
Sure. Right
near the intersection with Trapelo Road.
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
And we would host the reenactors, and usually there were cocktails in the farmhouse that we had.
I'm shocked.
And then they'd show us their guns and all that kind of good stuff. But my reflection, and I'm just curious, is, you know, when Revere got nailed up there on Route 2A, and then Dr. Samuel Prescott came down to alert Lincoln, what was going on with the folks at that time? Were they hanging out in the taverns? What was life like? I'm just kind of curious on the reflection of, would they go to the taverns? Were the taverns populated with the the farmers and the residents? Were they were obviously mad at the British, and was there drinking going on? Was there the effects of alcohol, and we're pissed at the British, and here they come, and we're going to go fight? And what do you think how did that work?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. And I'm going to start off by saying all of the above. The best way I could describe it is, first of all, yes, there are, for example, I'll take Lexington, and I know other towns were similar as well. After midnight, when John Parker ordered the Lexington militia to assemble, but before the Battle of Lexington, they were hanging out in Buckman's Tavern, those who did not live nearby. Those who lived nearby went back to their houses. But when you're in a tavern, there's no direct evidence they were drinking and they were absolutely blotto. But I mean, let's be realistic as well. I'm sure there was alcohol being consumed. And other research that my partner, Eric Getz, has done for Untapped History, and we mentioned on our tours, is keep in mind in the 18th century, water was not looked as beneficial as it is today. It was actually viewed as being poisoned because the rivers were polluted, lakes were, stagnant, and they had the mindset of what was going on back in England. So as a result, what were they drinking instead? Alcohol. And alcohol was seen as medicinal and actually had a positive, and that's a good one, JMB /DB. I'm glad you're sharing the beer. That's a perfect example of consuming alcohol. I don't think there's no accounts. Well, I take that back. There is an account in Cambridge or Monotony where a few guys simply said, screw it. It's the end of the world. I'm not going to participate in the fight. If it's the end of the world, where do you go? One or two places, the church or tavern. And these three gentlemen went to a tavern. Unfortunately, if my memory serves me correctly, they were actually killed as the British were coming through the tavern on the retreat backwards. So I will say it in a long, I hope I answered your question, Bob, but yes, alcohol definitely was present. I don't have direct evidence that anyone was sauced, but let's also be realistic. Alcohol played such a unique role that it was present.
Not only that, but I figured that the taverns were the kind of the meeting places.
They were the second most important place in the community. The first place people would think when they see, for example, old Congregationalist churches, oh, that's where the sermons took place. That's where the religious services. No, the number one important place was a meeting house. Number one, meeting house would be where church services would take place and your town meetings. But it's almost equal, very, very close. Second place were your taverns. That's where your business took place. That's where you would get your news. That's where you would meet your neighbors. That's where you would engage in gaming and entertainment. Taverns were more of a family gathering than just the guys getting together to, drink. But yes, they were a very, very important and influential part of various communities in New England life.
Very good. Thanks.
No problem. Thank you.
Any other questions? Alex, I have a quick one. Did you come across any names of people from the Newberries that were fighting in Lexington and Concord?
Not yet, no. Well, let me take that back. One thing that is a little known fact is the residents of Lexington. They have very strong ties to Newberry. When a lot of the settlers in the 17th century and the early 18th century were starting to move to the interior, a lot of the Newberry residents who moved to the interior went to the Lexington area. So there was a lot of familial ties between Lexington and Newberry during the time. Newberry, I haven't caught Newberry. I'm glad you brought that up because I forgot to mention that during the talk. What happened with Newberry and Newburyport on April 19th? Well, an alarm rider arrived some point between 11 and 12 in Newburyport to announce Lexington and Concord had taken place. And they initially refused to believe him. They thought it was going to be a repeat of the Salem affair, or it was just a false rumor. Once again, fake news. So they decided to send an alarm rider down to Danvers. And Danvers responded by saying, all our militia companies have mobilized. They're on the way. Yes, this is what happened. The alarm rider returned to Newberry and Newburyport, at which point the militia companies mobilized. The route of march, I believe Newberry and Newburyport took was not down 1A. I believe it probably would have taken them somewhat of a path that eventually would have dumped them onto 97 and then worked their way down that way. Or they would have come down through Haverhill, working their way through Haverhill into Andover, eventually through Tewksbury. But by my accounts, the Newberry Minute and the minute companies, the militia companies, and the private companies, for example, the independent Marines, probably didn't arrive outside the siege of Boston until April 20th.
Fantastic. Okay, we're at 8:45. Any other final questions? One last question from the crowd. You can unmute yourself, and I see JMB has one. Go ahead.
Hi, Justin from Rings Island.
Hey, Jay.
Justin,
sorry.
You talk about blood coming up to the ankles in some of these stories.
Yeah.
Quantity-wise, like how many people were getting killed during these first couple of days?
There were the British casualties were in the hundreds, and the American casualties approached about close to 100, 120 between wounded and dead. British casualties were roughly about 200 to 300 between wounded and dead. Keep in mind also some of these accounts, which I do want to also include, their original period accounts. One thing I didn't give my disclaimer on was some of this could have been propaganda pieces as well. Okay, there are definitely some accounts coming out that were definitely of propaganda value, but it was keep in mind, for the time, for the close quarters, the burning of the property, the vandalism, the theft was more offensive to the residents, and the killing was a close second in the level of offensiveness. So it was, but I'll give you also a counter to that.
Because a couple of hundred fatalities over a whole region doesn't
Right.
seem like a lot.
Right. But then the counter I was going to give to you, which you're right, but the counter to that is if you look at the Jason Russell house, where there was close to a dozen casualties inside the house, where it was room-to-room fighting between the Danvers militia companies and British light infantry. And it was literally hand-to-hand and being fired at close quarters. In that scenario, you're going to have blood everywhere because it's so compartmentalized in that area. But it is a very good question. I think, some of the houses that you're seeing this large amount of quantity of death and destruction, it's evidence of hand-to-hand combat taking place in there.
Thanks.
No problem. Thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you everybody for attending. It's, I think it was very successful virtual first Friday. We intend to have, as this seems to be going on, we intend to have another one next month. So stay tuned and watch your emails, Facebooks, and other social media for that. So with that, thank you, Alex.
Guys, thank you so much. I
Thanks.
appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
And,
Alex. That was
have
great.
a good evening, everyone. A good weekend, and stay safe.
Take care. Bye-bye.